Chapter 36. In and out of the Stone Age. Mr. Singh. Meet Bluebird. He is just out of jail. He killed the man who was misbehaving with his lady. As soon as the deed was done, he came to the patrol officer and gave himself up. This incident took place in the summer of 1964 in Papua New Guinea. What was I doing in this big and rugged island north of Australia? I was invited by the Australian government to spend 10 days in Papua New Guinea. I was at the time rapporteur of the UN Committee on Decolonization. This territory was being administered by Australia. Strictly speaking, Australia was never a colonizing or imperialist country. Nevertheless, Papua New Guinea was included in the committee's agenda of non-self-governing territories. For me, this Australian outpost was given virgin territory. All I knew was that it had been a part of the German Empire from 1884 to 1914. After World War I, it came under Australian rule. New Guinea was rich in gold. Papua was not rich and even more inaccessible. In Canberra, B, the other committee member, along with me was the representative from Iran, but briefed by the concerned officials looking after Papua New Guinea. Our first stop was at Port Moresby. We were invited to dinner by the governor. He and his wife had seen better days. They were in Port Moresby on sufferance. The wife was even more prickly about being dumped in a dump called Port Moresby. After dinner, my Iranian colleague asked if he could use the toilet. He was admonished. Here we do not ask to use the toilet. We say, "Can I go for a walk?" Next day we embarked on our passage to the unknown and the unseen. A 4-seater Cessna aircraft was at our disposal. We were, to our great surprise, informed that in Papua New Guinea, one either walked or flew. No roads existed. The terrain was covered by very thick, impenetrable forest. No horses, neither cows, buffaloes or deer. Only pigs, introduced by the Japanese during World War II. However, the country is an ornithologist's paradise. Our first halt was at Mountbatten, 6,000 feet above sea level. Our tiny plane was flying at 8,000 feet. Fasten your seatbelts. We are about to land. I looked for an airport. None was to be seen. The plane came down on an uneven field, not much bigger than a football pitch. It halted a few yards away from the edge of a deep gorge. We were to spend the night with the commissioner who received us at the airport. I do not remember his name. He was dressed as a Pakka Sahib, in khaki shirt and shorts, matching stockings and a felt hat that one saw the Gurkhas wearing. After dinner, he gave us a fascinating briefing on life in the island, its fauna and flora, its geography, the life of the people, aborigines, Polynesians, their ways of living. He was the only white man within 200 miles. His sole contact with the world was by a radio set, a device to keep in touch with Port Moresby. Often, these did not function. He spoke the local language fluently. Casually, he informed us that the island had 7,000 languages, not dialects, mind you. Without being patronizing, he said, the Australian policy might smack of paternalism, but it was committed to bringing a Stone Age pupil into the 20th century. The pupils were primitive, their customs barbaric. They believed in a supernatural world of devils, sorcery and ghosts. They used cows, bows and arrows with deadly accuracy. Their diet was simple: cocoa, millet, sago, pigs and fruit. Bitter nut chewing was endemic. No sexual taboos. Occasionally, jealousy led to cannibalism and murder. Their life was had remained static for thousands of years. Neither man nor woman wore any clothing. Did the people wish to stay with Australia? The people did not. Early next morning we flew to Goa. The airfield was at a 30-degree angle. The plane landed and taxied up the hill, then stopped. The bespoke van and placed stones behind the wheels so that our aircraft would not slide down. A noble experience. The sight we made was not something we were prepared for. The patrol officer, not more than 25 years of age, dressed in a white shirt, shorts and white stocking, took us to the school. About 20 boys and girls were sitting at little desks, reading a lesson in English. On the blackboard was written, "Welcome to our guest." Well, in this little room in the middle of an inhospitable island, the Stone Age was meeting the 20th century. A few of the parents of the children were looking at our plane, attired in almost nothing. Our task began. We asked through the interpreter, the assembled cuckoo tribal leader, "Would you like to live under Australia, or would you prefer self-determination or independence?" What followed was farcical. The interpreter translated our UN mandate into Pidgin English for the benefit of the second interpreter, who in turn translated the Pidgin into the region's language, who then asked the fourth interpreter to put it into the local dialect. The dozen or so natives heard him out, with incomprehension writ large on their faces. The eldest one grunted a few words, which got back to us via the serpentine translator's route. He asked if we could repeat our question. We gave up. Yet we were not wholly disappointed. We saw the future in the classroom. The weight of the past would be reduced soon. The Australians were dedicated, determined and driven. They had done much. Much more remained to be done. Our last call was the coastal city of Rabaul, with a fine harbour and a not too intimidating volcano in the background. The climate was bracing. The grown-up sons of the hill tribes were running carpentry shops, first aid stores and other small-scale industries. The schools were full. The hospital was modern. Not far from Rabaul is our island of Guadalcanal, where during World War II, future President John F. Kennedy's boat PT-109 was sunk by the Japanese and he almost lost his life. Further down is Bougainvillea Island. The name of the flower originates from the island. A large white community populated the town. They were specimens of an era long over. Our mission was finally rewarded. In Rabaul, we talked to men and women who were the first to be educated and had rewarded. In Rabaul, we talked to men and women who were the first to be educated and had not abandoned their parents, their past or their tribe. Some were members of village councils and locally elected bodies. Yes, they were ready for self-rule. 15 years later, Papua New Guinea would become a member of the United Nations. Thank you very much. Have a hopeful day. Chapter 37. Radhakrishnan surprises Mao. By the end of 1956, the momentous event in Egypt, the Suez Crisis and Hungary, the Hungarian Revolution were over. Sino-Indian relations were still in the Hindi-Chini bye-bye phase. Minor irritations on the border did not yet cause much worry on account of Zhou Enlai's assurances to Prime Minister Nehru. In December 1956, the Dalai Lama came to India for the Buddha Jayanti celebration. Zhou Enlai was also in India and did not take kindly to the warm reception given to His Holiness, who was keen to stay in India. Both Prime Ministers advised him to return to Tibet. The rest of 1957 did not see any major public altercation between Beijing and New Delhi. The most spectacular event of the year was the space flight of the Russian satellite Sputnik. All of us in the embassy looked for it with our binoculars, but without success. It caused joy in Beijing and dismay in Washington. So did Khrushchev's devastating comebacks. Rezar Kaganovich, George Malenkov, and Vyacheslav Molotov of power. In China, the 100 Flowers campaign was launched, which allowed the people to freely express their views. The Great Leap Forward disaster was a couple of years away, and the Cultural Revolution 9. In October, Mao Zedong left Beijing for Moscow to participate in the 40th anniversary of the Russian Revolution of 1917. The entire diplomatic corps was at the airport to see him off. He arrived wearing a solar hat, which probably had accompanied the great man to Beijing from Yan'an. Before leaving, Mao Zedong played host to Vice President Radhakrishnan, who arrived in the Chinese capital on 18 September 1957. At the airport, he was received by the top Chinese leadership, Master Chu Te, future President Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, Madam Sun Qingling, Marshals Chen Yi and Ho Lung, and the mayor of Beijing, Peng Jian. This was a very great honor. The Chinese had done their homework. Radhakrishnan was for them not only the Vice President of India, but also a world-class philosopher. He had been ambassador to the Soviet Union between 1949 and 1952. The highlight of his Moscow stay was a meeting with Stalin, who had not received Mrs. Vijayalakshmi Pandit, Radhakrishnan's predecessor. Normally, Stalin granted interviews late at night. For Radhakrishnan, he said 9 p.m. He had also remarked, "I would like to meet the ambassador who spends all his time in bed writing." China had much appreciated Radhakrishnan's deploring the absence of the People's Republic of China from the UN. From the airport, the Vice President was driven to Chungnanhai, where Mao Zedong and other top leaders lived. I was attached to the Vice President's delegation, which also included S. Gopal and Jagat Mehta. Radhakrishnan was put up in a house next to Mao's. I too managed to spend one night in this privileged abode. There was some speculation whether Chairman Mao would be in Beijing to receive Radhakrishnan. The guessing game was over. Mao returned to Beijing day earlier. Before writing about the Vice President's talks with the chairman, I must relate a remarkable incident. While Zhou Enlai had a way of influencing people but being elastic at the same time, Mao Zedong was made of a different metal. No one disagreed with him. He had a powerful mind. He was a poet and a voracious reader. What was unique was his personal will, and that will he made sure was executed. Writer and Nobel Peace Prize recipient Henry Kissinger was mesmerized when he first met Mao. Theodore White, an American correspondent in China before 1949, has written that Mao's will, with the exception of Lenin, was the most formidable will of the 20th century. Many world leaders called on Mao, including President Nixon. Mao never returned the compliment. When Dr. Radhakrishnan called on Mao Zedong, he was received in the courtyard of the chairman's house. Zhou Enlai was also present. After shaking hands, the vice president patted Mao on his left cheek. The chairman had never been subjected to such familiarity. He was momentarily taken aback. The vice president was quick to put Mao at ease by saying, "Mr. Chairman, don't be alarmed. I did the same thing to Stalin and the Pope." What an exit line. In the Mao-Radhakrishnan talks, no serious problems were raised. Taiwan did figure. Dr. Radhakrishnan said that the Taiwan problem would no doubt be solved peacefully. Time was on China's side. Mao made A startling observation. China was willing to wait 100 years. The vice president asked about peaceful coexistence. Mao said he was for it. Dr. Radhakrishnan was a bit didactic. The professor in him put aside the political nitty-gritty. To Dr. Radhakrishnan's observation that if China and India stood together, the world would take note of it. Mao said that if India and China stood together for 20 years, no one would be able to make us go on different paths. 20 years were reduced to 5 when China attacked India in 1962. But that is another story. Alas, the history never repeats. Chapter 38. A Rendezvous with Nelson Mandela. I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all pure persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. Nelson Mandela. 20th April 1964. Nelson Mandela is 94 now. He is the ultimate hero, admired, even venerated around the world. Hemingway's definition of courage, grace under pressure, fits Mandela like a glove. After he was released from jail on 11 February 1990, the government of BP Singh sent an additional sacrifice from the Ministry of External Affairs to convey India's greeting to the great man. It was an amazing inadequate gesture on such a momentous occasion. Several of us in the Congress party suggested to Rajiv Gandhi that we send a high-powered Congress delegation to meet Mandela to felicitate him. Such a delegation was sent. P.V. Narasimha Rao, Anand Sharma, and myself were selected for the purpose. I shall write about it some other time. Today I will recall Rajiv Gandhi's rendezvous with Nelson Mandela. Namibia was to attain independence on 21 March 1990. India had vigorously supported the Namibian freedom struggle. We provided all the help we could, except supplying arms. Sam Nujoma, who would become the country's first president, was the undisputed leader of the freedom fighters. He had been to India several times. I had known him since my Lusaka days, 1977-80. Rajiv Gandhi, though no longer Prime Minister, was invited to attend the Independence Day celebration. He accepted the invitation and asked me to accompany him. A major problem confronted us: how to get to Windhoek without touching South Africa. We had no diplomatic relations with it and had consistently condemned the imbecile racist follies of the South African regime. The only way South Africa could be bypassed was traveling via Lusaka. I telephoned President Konda of Zambia to inform him that Rajiv Gandhi would be halting in Lusaka on his way to Windhoek and would like to meet him. President Konda's response was heartwarming. Natwar, not only is Rajiv's welcome, he must stay with me and fly to Windhoek with me in my personal plane. Rajiv Gandhi decided to travel economy class to Lusaka on a Zambian Airways flight. Soon after takeoff from Bombay, many passengers lined up to ask Rajiv Gandhi for his autograph. Commotion followed. The cabin crew complained that in such a situation they could not serve dinner. The purser very politely requested Rajiv Gandhi to shift to the first class cabin. I pleaded with him to accept this practical proposal. He would have none of it unless I and Gupta too were upgraded. P.K. Gupta was his security officer. He was killed at C. Perumburu when Rajiv was assassinated. The cabin staff immediately obliged. When we landed at Lusaka airport, we were received by an officer from State House, where we were to be put up. On arrival there, Rajiv Gandhi was greeted by Kenneth Candour, who escorted him to his suite. I got a room next to Rajiv. For the next 5 days, Rajiv had to suffer my company. It was great fun, being alone with him. It was also an unforgettable experience. The first thing I noticed about him was his implementation of the democracy of manners. He greeted everyone with a winning smile and a curtsy. He was totally unconcerned about rank. He used to get restless if he had nothing to do. He had brought a small radio with him. He installed an aerial in his room to bear BBC News. Candour treated him like a younger brother. He hosted a dinner for leaders of several countries who were traveling to Windhoek. I remember one in particular, Edward Shevardnadze, the foreign minister of the USSR. When Rajiv Gandhi was PM, this man used to be excessively defensive. In Lusaka, he hardly noticed us. Rajiv met Nelson Mandela on the morning 21 March 1990. We were in our band galas, awaiting our brush with history. Nelson Mandela greeted him with affection and bow. Gandhi's opening words were, "Mr. Mandela, when my daughter learned that I would be meeting you, she made me promise that when I shook hands with you, I should think of her. This I am doing now." Mandela enjoyed that very much. Pleasantries did not take much time. Rajiv asked about the situation in South Africa. Before answering, Mandela recalled the support of the Congress Party during his imprisonment. About the future, he was realistic. Much needed to be done. He wanted to bring in the whites on board. Negotiations with friends, FW, de Klerk. He was also in Windhoek. Rajiv Gandhi met him briefly. Would be complicated and prolonged. No government gives up power easily. He himself was catching up with all that had transpired during his incarceration. I listened spellbound. Here was real greatness. No rancor, no bitterness, elemental serenity combined with controlled passion. Rajiv Gandhi gave Mandela a tour de horizon of the Indian scene. Mandela listened with rapt attention. Rajiv asked him what his most urgent priority was. Reconciliation and reconstruction was the reply. Such brevity, such clear-headedness. It was an extraordinary summing up. What we achieved on that momentous morning were rapport and understanding. Mandela at the time was in his 72nd year. Rajiv Gandhi in his 45th. The calendar differences in age were transcended in the first few minutes. Mandela escorted Rajiv Gandhi to the car. Mrs. Winnie Mandela joined us. She was ebullient, friendly and looked quite stunning. During the drive back, Rajiv Gandhi, I did not talk. We were still breathing the Mandela's aroma. At the flag-raising ceremony on 21 March 1990, Rajiv Gandhi and I sat with the foreign minister. The names of prominent leaders were called out. Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, former Prime Minister of India, he was semi-dozing. I gave him a nose. He got up and waved. The audience applauded. Next, His Excellency B.P. Singh, Prime Minister of India, India. Silence. His name was called out a second time. No response. The Prime Minister had failed to make it to the venue on time. Thank you very much for listening and greetings. Hats off to the Nelson Mandela. Now move to chapter 39. A distraught Begum. During my tenure as ambassador to Pakistan, I met Begum Nusrat Bhutto twice in private at her home in Clifton, Karachi. Soon after taking up my post, I learned that the Indian embassy had no contact whatever with the Bhuttos. I was informed that Prime Minister Morarji Desai's instruction had been to keep away from Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's family. Morarji Bhai was one of the very few heads of government who had not appealed to President Zia-ul-Haq to spare Bhutto's life. Indira Gandhi, then out of office, had appealed for mercy. On my very first consultation trip to New Delhi, I apprised Prime Minister Indira Gandhi of his incongruity. I added that my counterpart in New Delhi, the Pakistani ambassador, frequently met opposition leaders, media moguls, etc. I sought her permission to get in touch with the Bhuttos. Without a moment's hesitation, she gave me the go-ahead. The nervous system of Karachi was at the disposal of political warlords, whose wealth made it unnecessary for them to pay heed to the square law that surrounded their splendor. Their lifestyle made a mockery of the French and Russian revolutions. They all ate cakes. All were formidable politicians chasing posts, not principles. The most prominent was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's widow, Begum Nusrat. President Zia-ul-Haq was a creation of Zulfikar Bhutto. The general had no hesitation in sending his mentor to the gallows. He reduced his widow to a non-person. Getting in touch with Begum Sahiba turned out to be a complicated and difficult undertaking. She was under intense surveillance. So was I. My deputy, Sati Rama, had got to know Dr. Niazi. He had been Bhutto's dentist and was a member of the Pakistan People's Party (PPP). I went to his clinic to have my teeth checked. I asked if he could arrange my meeting with Nusrat Bhutto. He gave no assurance, but said he would try. He was taking a big risk. After several false starts, the meeting was fixed on 21 August 1981. I asked Mani Shankar Iyer, our consul general in Karachi, to accompany me. We drove in his official car with the Indian flag flying. The drive took less than 5 minutes. The large gate was discreetly opened. We were ushered into a rectangular well-appointed room. There were the two ladies, Mother Nusrat and her daughter Sanam. One could almost taste gloom. Sadness enveloped the duo. What once must have been the hub and home of gaiety and pleasure now offered the silence of the graveyard. One item stood out in the room, a striking lapis lazuli portrait of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. The man had taste. Begum Nusrat Bhutto Begum began by saying that at first she really did not believe that Indian ambassador would come calling. Many busybodies had been conveying all kinds of messages. She thanked me for visiting her. After handing over Mrs. Gandhi's letter to her, it was to thank Mrs. Bhutto for the condolence she had sent after Sanjay Gandhi's tragic death. I inquired about the political development in Pakistan. She said that the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in December 1979 had given legitimacy to Zia, which he did not have after hanging Chairman Bhutto. As a matter of fact, Zia had become an international outcast. The ground reality was that there was widespread discontent. The high-handedness of the army was causing resentment, but she was pessimistic about any anti-Zia movement gathering support. He had skillfully divided or neutralized all political parties. She said, on the surface, it looks that Zia-ul-Haq is in full control. It is true that Pakistan is not agitating against Zia. There was no real serious challenge to the military. She added that even if he was overthrown, he would be succeeded by another general. However, if the opposition put up a joint front, Zia could be overthrown. At the moment, this had to be ruled out. We also touched on the restlessness in Balochistan. She emphatically denied that her late husband's stand had been anti-Baloch. In fact, he had made Balochistan the fourth state of Pakistan. Previously, it had been an agency. He had consistently struggled to ensure that divisive elements and feudal lords did not combine to defeat his reforms. She asserted that in a free election, the people of Balochistan would vote for the PPP. She also emphasized that the Pathans of the northwest frontier province but critical of Zia's Afghan policy. Up to this point, the exchange was politely benign, banal, routine, and in real danger of becoming boring. But soon, liveliness took over. I respectfully sought her permission to learn the true facts about her husband's last 24 hours. I was doing so with great reluctance. Confusion needed to be cleared, misinformation corrected. This is what she said. The night before the hanging, the military had raided their home. They were looking for a copy of the Rahman report, which had incriminated the army for brutalities committed in East Pakistan in 1971. They found nothing. The same night, another group met Chairman Bhutto in jail. They told Bhutto that his life would be spared if he owned responsibility for what happened in East Pakistan instead of the army as mentioned in the report. This he refused to do. Emaciated though he was, he hit out at the offending officer. A scuffle followed. Bhutto fell and his head hit the floor. He died on the spot. She and her daughters Benazir and Sana had their last meeting with Bhutto late in the evening before the hanging. The chairman had conducted himself with superhuman courage and dignity. The jail superintendent had informed Begum Bhutto that her husband would be hanged at 4:30 a.m. The time was later changed to 2:30 a.m. The relatives who lowered the body into the grave in Larkana noted that the usual post-hanging features were missing: a swollen tongue, bulging eyes. The neck had not been broken because the face could be easily turned toward Mecca before the body was interned. A deep silence followed. I was much moved. All I could say at taking was, "Madam, now that we both keep questionable company, I hope contact would be monitored." She agreed. The next time I met her was in early 1982 with my wife. Begum Bhutto was quite clearly seriously ill. She insisted that we stay beyond the allotted time. We did. Her gracious hospitality touched us. We spent nearly 90 minutes at her home. She invited me to look at her husband's library. I am a bibliophile and have a 10,000 book library. Mr. Bhutto's library was a much larger literary sphere. Not one paperback. Autobiographies and biographies filled many shelves, also history and international affairs. Begum Bhutto complained that she was not permitted to go abroad for treatment. She was spitting blood and was not responding to local treatment. I ventured to suggest that if a team of doctors concluded that it was necessary for her to go abroad, they should say so publicly. In that event, a peace could be made on humanitarian grounds. To President Zia, the team of doctors obliged. Mrs. Gandhi and several other leaders made public appeal. Begum Bhutto was allowed to proceed abroad for treatment. I learned President Zia's chilling facts. Thank you very much for listening. Chapter 40. In Russia with Sonia Gandhi and President Putin. Sonia Gandhi arrived in Moscow on the morning of 14th August 2005. I was with her. Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko received her at the Vnukovo International Airport. In the afternoon, she spoke at the Center for National Growth at President Hotel. Her subject was Dialogue of Civilization. It was a takeoff from Samuel Huntington's short sermon, The Clash of Civilization. Our Moscow host Vladimir Yukonin, the chairman of the center, was also the deputy minister of the railway. In the afternoon, in glorious weather, we left for Vladimir by helicopter. I was at a loss to know why Sonia Gandhi was visiting an obscure medieval town of which I had never heard. On arrival, I was struck by the pristine beauty of the place. It was snuggled between tall trees and churches. History had not bypassed Vladimir. Time had. The inhabitants were attired in clothes which had defeated time, no concession to fashion. Sonia and I walked along with our guide. Soon we arrived at an unkempt courtyard. The main building had been a church, now converted into a museum. Inside we came to an octagonal room. On one of the walls were stuck a number of paper slips. Sonia was much interested in these. She reads Russian and was obviously looking for something. Natwar, my father, was a prisoner of war here during World War II. He escaped walking all the way to Italy. She was deeply moved. This was for her a very special moment. I listened. My comment would have been banal and inappropriate. The next day we left for St. Petersburg, a city of breathtaking beauty and inspiring history, and home to some of Russia's greatest writers, including Pushkin and Dostoevsky. A city where in November 1970, Vladimir Lenin had announced the birth of the Soviet Union. The thousand-day Nazi siege of Leningrad during World War II is an epic saga of defiance and suffering. The city starved but did not yield. It was previously bounded but emerged with its head high. St. Petersburg was named after Peter the Great, who called it his window on the west. Its classical colonnades, barrack houses, its impeccable architecture, its splendors will forever remain etched in my mind. It's an alluring city. Its avenues are straight and elegant. The death of communism heralded the renewal of St. Petersburg. It is not a brand-new city. It is a reaffirmation of man's ingenuity, a statement of life. Our host in St. Petersburg was President Vladimir Putin. He was staying in the Konstantinovsky Palace overlooking Finland Bay. We were put up in a ducal guest house next to the palace. Putin, unlike his Soviet predecessors, is cultivated, urban, witty and sophisticated. He has a strong, compact frame. He is a karate champion. On such occasions, Sonia is at her best. Ease of manner stands out. A sagacious listener. She gives nothing away. Her earlier diffidence has given way to self-assurance. I have closely watched the evolution of her personality. The official talks in the morning lasted 19 minutes and were followed by a working lunch. The menu card I still have. It is signed by Putin, Sonia Gandhi in Hindi and myself. After lunch, the president bid goodbye to Sonia Gandhi and wished us a pleasant boat ride on the Gulf of Finland. Sonia and I returned to the guest house to change. When we arrived at the pier, whom do we see? President Putin waiting to receive Sonia. I told her in a whisper that this was an exceptionally warm and unusual gesture. And it was. Not only that, Putin said he would join us for the 40-minute yacht ride. The favorable informality and relaxed ambience was a joy. It was a perfect June day. Blue sky and a simmering deep blue Finland bay added enchantment to the outing. The conversation flowed from the jovial to the serious. At one point I said to the president that Khrushchev was well remembered in India. During his memorable visit to India in 1955, he had, while in Srinagar, on the spur of the moment, announced that Kashmir was a part of India. Foreign Minister Andrew Gromyko was left speechless. His rumbosus boss has made a momentous foreign policy pronouncement without consulting his minister, and that, too, on so contentious a subject. Khrushchev had become an instant hero in India. Observing how Sonia and I were at so much ease with each other, Putin asked, Mr. How long have you known Mrs. Gandhi's family? Before I could respond, a smiling Sonia intervened. Now he will go on till the evening. I told the Russian president that I had known the family since 1944. A few minutes before we were to disembark, I told Putin how much we had appreciated The Overview of Developments in Russia by Vladimir Yukinin while in Moscow. On touching grounds, whom do we see? The ubiquitous Yakunin himself. Putin went up to him and asked, "What fairy tales have you been telling the foreign minister?" Yakunin's face fell. We took leave of the president and proceeded to the State Hermitage Museum. I had learned much praise of this citadel of art and culture. It had been preserved and treated as a symbol of Russia's rich cultural heritage. I was more than keen to see it. Surely it could not surpass the British and Metropolitan Museum of London and New York, nor could it possibly compare favorably with the Louvre. More importantly, I believed in art for art's sake. The Soviets did not. For them, art had to be utilitarian. I was not wholly ignorant of European art. I was more than familiar with Renoir, Gauguin, Cézanne, Monet, Degas. Sonia's interest, knowledge, and understanding of the visual arts was profound. I tagged along with her. She pointed out to me one masterpiece after another. After 3 hours, we walked down to a charming pavilion built by Peter the Great on the shore of the Neva River. It was almost a kilometer's walk. The temperature was over 95 degrees. Like her mother-in-law, Sonia walks fast. I made no attempt to keep up with her. I thought that after seeing the St. Peter's Pavilion, we would call it a day. "No," she said to me, "Natwar, you are tired. Go back to the guest house. I will spend some more time here." After a quiet dinner, Vladimir Yakunin took us to enjoy an opera. It was nearly 11 p.m. when the operatic agony ended. I was bleary-eyed. For Sonia, it had been a long day. She asked me to tell Yakunin that she would like to return to the guest house. He would have none of it. Mrs. Gandhi must see the white night over the horizon, and that too from a loss. She relented. I had heard much about the white nights. What I saw was a sight so unique that I shall always remember it. There was no midnight at 12 p.m. It was a white night. The sky was bathed in a golden grey. The waters were still. So was the sky and the city. On the lounge, Yakunin was sitting opposite me. He walked over in unconcealed excitement. "Mr. Gandhi, what did you say to the president about me?" I kept a straight face, saying that I had told President Putin that you are so and so. Please don't joke. You are a very important man. The president had appointed me railway minister. I do not know how to thank you. I said to Sonia that I had made one lifelong friend in Russia. Next day, she left for Delhi. I for us. Wonderful day. Chapter 41. Margaret Thatcher, Chandraswami and I. India House is among the better-known diplomatic establishments in London. I first set eyes on the imposing building in 1952 when I was a student at Cambridge University. 30 years later, I entered India House as Deputy High Commissioner. One of my less attractive duties was to meet the unreasonable demands of visitors for India. Not all were disagreeable, but many were. In the early summer of 1975, Chandraswami telephoned me. He was in London. The late Yaspal Kapoor of the emergency fame had asked him to contact me. Chandraswami invited me to meet him at his place. I said if he wished to see me, he should come to India House. This he did the next day. At the time, he was in his late 20s. He was in his sadhu attire. He did not speak a word of English. Now he does. At this, our first meeting, he dropped names, well-known names. I was quite obviously expected to be impressed. I was not. After a few days, he again came to see me. He invited my wife and me to have dinner with him. The food was delicious. Chandraswami had already made a few cheras who hovered around Swamiji and did his bidding. After dinner, he said to us, I will show you something you have never seen. He then produced a large sheet of white paper and drew lines from top to bottom and from left to right, like a chessboard. Next, he produced 3 strips of paper and asked my wife to write a question on each strip, roll it into a ball, and then place it on a square on the cross chessboard. My wife wrote the questions in English. He closed his eyes and went into a trance. I was by this time getting restless and looking at my watch. Suddenly, he asked my wife to pick up one of the paper balls. She did so and opened it. Chandraswami then told her what the question was. He was spot on. My wife, who is an amateur astrologer, was skeptical at this stage. When Chandraswami got the next 2 reading, I could not. Maybe I could not, as a rationalist, accept mumbo jumbo. Neither could I dismiss Chandraswami as a hoax. A few days later, Y.V. Chavan, the then External Affairs Minister, was on his way to the United States. I went to meet him at Heathrow. He confirmed he knew Chandraswami well. He does have some kind of siddhi, special power, and the minister said. I also told Chavan that Chandraswami had asked me to arrange a meeting with Lord Mountbatten and also with Mrs. Thatcher. Should I arrange these meetings? To my discomfiture and surprise, Chavan saw no harm in Chandraswami meeting either Mountbatten or Margaret Thatcher. That very evening, Chandraswami called me. Agya mil gayi? Got your permission? By now, my ease about Chandraswami was gradually beginning to erode. The fellow had a peculiar charm. He was, in addition, entertaining, also an accomplished raconteur. I rang up Lord Mountbatten. He said he would have been glad to meet your friend but could not do so. He was leaving for a holiday in Northern Ireland the next week. He would be away for 6 weeks. I was quite relieved. I informed Chandraswami. What about Mrs. Thatcher? Yes, indeed. What about Mrs. Thatcher? She had been elected leader of the Conservative Party 6 months earlier. Doubts still assailed me about Chandraswami meeting Margaret Thatcher, not yet the Iron Lady. I was taking a risk. Suppose Chandraswami made a fool of himself. I would look the bigger fool. I sought an appointment with the leader of the opposition. She promptly obliged. I met her in her tiny office in the House of Commons. I told her, I have come on an unusual errand. A young holy man from India is in London. He is a great admirer of yours. He is very keen to meet you and pay his respect. Her response was, if you think I should meet him. I said, what does he want to see me for? That he will tell you himself. I said. She agreed to meet the holy man in the House of Commons office early next week. Only 10 minutes. Deputy High Commissioner, she announced. I thanked her and left. Chandraswami was on cloud 9 when I gave him the news. I cautioned him not to do or say anything silly. I was putting my neck on the line for him. Chinta mat karo, don't worry, said the sage. So to the House of Commons the two of us proceeded. Chandraswami was dressed in his sadhu kit with a huge tirak on his forehead and a staff in his right hand. Rudraksh malas round his neck. He banged the staff on the board till I told him to stop doing so. I confess I had begun to feel conscious, not Chandraswami. Rusticity provides an armor of sorts. Chandraswami is not an unobtrusive individual. He relished the attention he was inviting. Finally, we reached Thatcher's office. With her was her parliamentary private secretary, Adam Butler, MP, son of Rab Butler, the Conservative leader. Introductions was over. Mrs. Thatcher asked, what did you want to see me for? Chandraswami spoke in Hindi. I translated. Tell her she will soon find out. His tone was arrogantly respectful. Mrs. Thatcher said, I am waiting. The clock was ticking away. Chandraswami was in no hurry. He asked for a large piece of paper. He then went through the same routine as with my wife. He gave Thatcher 5 strips of paper and requested her to write a question on each. She obliged, but with scarcely camouflaged irritation. Chandraswami then asked her to open the first paper ball. She did. He gave the text of the question in Hindi. I translated. Correct. I watched Mrs. Thatcher. The irritation gave way to subdued curiosity. Next question. Again bull's-eye. Curiosity replaced by interest. By the fourth question, the future Iron Lady's demeanor had changed. She began to look at Chandraswami not as a fraud but as a holy man indeed. My body language too had altered. Last question. Correct again. I heaved a sigh of relief. Mrs. Thatcher was now perched on the edge of the sofa. Chandraswami was like a triumphant ghoul. He took off his chappals and sat on the sofa in the lotus posture. I was appalled. Mrs. Thatcher seemed to approve. She asked supplementary questions. In each case, Chandraswami responded, almost overwhelmed. The future Prime Minister. She was on the verge of another question when Chandraswami regally announced that the sun had set. No more questions. I said to Mrs. Thatcher that I was only translating word for word. I was in no way responsible for what he said. Thatcher was not put out. She inquired if she could meet him again. I was entirely unprepared for this. Very coolly, almost condescendingly, he said, on Tuesday at 2:30 p.m. at the house of Sri Natwar Singh. I told him that he was overreaching himself by dictating to Mrs. Thatcher the day and time without taking into account her convenience. This was not injured. He was unmoved. कुंवर साहिब अनुवाद कर दीजिए और फिर देखिए. कुंवर साहिब translate and then see. I was astounded when she asked me, Deputy High Commissioner, where do you live? This was not all. What followed was something out of weird novel. Just as we were about to leave, Mr. Holy Man produced a talisman tied to not so tidy piece of string. He then pronounced that Thatcher should tie it on her left arm. When she came to my house on Tuesday, I was now on the verge of losing my temper, something which no diplomat would ever do. I said, I will not translate this rubbish. Mrs. Thatcher intervened to know what the holy man was saying. Mrs. Thatcher, please forgive me, but Chandraswami would like you to wear this talisman on your left arm. She took the talisman. We were saying our goodbyes when Chandraswami produced his Sartorial bomb. Turning to me, he said, Kuwar Sahib, kindly tell Mrs. Thatcher that on Tuesday she should wear a red poshak. I felt like hitting him. He was overdoing his act. I firmly told him that it was the height of bad manners to tell a lady what she should or should not wear. Thatcher looked a bit apprehensive at this not so mild altercation between a distraught deputy high commissioner and a somewhat ill-mannered holy man. Very reluctantly, I said to her that the holy man would be obliged if she wore a red dress on Tuesday. I was looking down at the floor when I said this. When we got into my car, I told Chandraswami what I thought of his boorish behavior. He was not one bit perturbed. He was certain she would wear the talisman and the red dress. I also told him that she was being polite and that she would not come to my house on Tuesday. I was wrong. On Tuesday at 2:30 p.m. sharp, Margaret Thatcher, leader of the Conservative Party, arrived at the Sun House, 9 Frognall Way, Hampstead. It was a beautiful day. She was wearing a splendid red dress. The talisman too was in its proper place. She asked many questions, but the most important related to the chances of her becoming Prime Minister. My wife was also present. Chandraswami did not disappoint Thatcher. He prophesied that she would be Prime Minister for 9, 11 or 13 years. Thatcher, no doubt, believed that she would be PM one day, but 9, 11 or 13 years seemed a bit much. I and my wife thought the same too. Thatcher put one final question. When would she become the Prime Minister? Chandraswami pronounced. In 3 or 4 years, he was proved right. She was PM for 11 years. The narrative should have ended here, but there was an aftermath. The Commonwealth Summit was held in Lusaka, Zambia in 1979. Margaret Thatcher had by then become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I had been posted to Zambia in August 1977, along with other High Commissioners. I went to the Lusaka airport to see Thatcher. When she greeted me and my wife, I gently whispered, "Our man had been proved right." For a moment she looked flustered. Then she took me aside. "High Commissioner, we don't talk about these matters." "Of course not, Prime Minister, of course not," said I. Wonderful Chandraswami. Let's move to the chapter 42, the ubiquitous Swami. I have already related the Margaret Thatcher Chandraswami encounter. Now I will relate two more uncanny incidents, one in 1985, the other in 1989. Commonwealth summits are held every 2 years. The 1985 summit was scheduled for September at Nassau, the capital of the Bahamas. I was at the time Minister of State for Fertilizers, a ministry as far from foreign affairs as the North Pole is from the equator. Regardless, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi involved me in the preparations underway for the summit. I took a reconnaissance jaunt to the capital of the host country, who the tiny island managed so colossal and unmistakable. I arrived at New York in early September. On my way to Nassau, we had no resident mission in the Bahamas. Our ambassador in Washington was concurrently accredited to the island state. I asked the permanent representative of India to the UN to get in touch with his counterpart in Nassau to arrange my meeting with Prime Minister Lyndon Pindling. I waited a couple of days. There was no response from the permanent mission of the Bahamas. It had been a frustrating wait. I decided to proceed to Washington to try my luck there. Ambassador Pratap Kaul contacted the ambassador of the Bahamas and requested him to arrange my meeting with his PM for discussing the agenda of the summit and also look at the bandobast arrangements. The 1983 summit had met in New Delhi. As its chief coordinator, I had acquired a thoroughly undeserved reputation as a bandobast expert. In Washington too, we fared no better than in New York. Obviously, the embassies of the Bahamas were a vacuisant tribe. After 3 wasted days, I decided to return to New York. It had been an annoying wild goat chase. Then fate intervened. The ambassador informed me that Chandraswami wished to speak to me. I was both intrigued and surprised. How in the name of heaven did the Swami get to know of my presence in Washington, D.C.? Pratap Kaul informed me that Chandraswami was in Ottawa. When I spoke to him, he was chuckling away. "Kuan Sahib, Pindling से meeting नहीं हो रही है आपकी? Kuan Sahib, you are unable to have a meeting with Pindling. How do you know?" I asked, somewhat annoyed by his one-upmanship. He ignored my question and announced, मैंने आपका मीटिंग का इंतजाम कर दिया है. Pindling आपसे कल मिलेगा. I have arranged for a meeting. Pindling will meet you tomorrow. I am seldom at a loss for words. This, however, was astounding. Where our missions in New York and Washington had not succeeded, Chandraswami had. He had pulled off a minor diplomatic coup. Puzzled, I asked, "How did you know that I was in Washington?" "Kuan Sahib, मैं आपकी खबर रखता हूँ." "Kuan Sahib, I keep track of you." This was even more mystifying because I had not had any contact with him for many years. His networking skills were impressive indeed. I did get to see the Prime Minister in Nassau. Sun, sand, sea and surf made it a paradise for burning the candle at both ends and in the middle too. Authors were writing their masterpieces in seaside cottages, the uninhabited. They were in a vast majority. but full of bounce and bohemianism and much less else. This was Rajiv Gandhi's first summit. He excelled. He spoke after Margaret Thatcher and performed brilliantly. He was the youngest of the heads. He was not hesitant or intimidated. Several leaders walked over to congratulate him after his speech. I distinctly remember the Sri Lankan President J.R. Jayawardene and the Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, among others. This was a special gesture. Rajiv Gandhi was pleased and surprised. After all, he was a novice, fallen among aging heavyweight political dinosaurs. An aside that I recall fondly. During the summit, a cricket match between India and Sri Lanka was on. I asked Rajiv to chant Jayawardene this way: I wish Sri Lanka luck and India success. Jayawardene replied, thanks, I wish India luck and Sri Lanka success. 4 years passed. I was in Paris, leading the Indian delegation to the conference on banning of chemical weapons. On the second day, I came down with flu. My throat was so sore, I felt as if razor blades were cutting against my tonsils. I felt miserable and irritated. My speech had to be postponed. My private secretary was showing me a few coded telegrams when the telephone rang. Sir, Mr. Chandraswami is on the line. It was far too uncanny, but too. I was in no mood to talk, but could not resist speaking to wondering Swami. Sahib, you are not feeling well? Who is looking after you? I said, first tell me, how did you come to know of my illness and presence in Paris? I will tell you when I meet you. I am bringing President Mitterrand's doctor to see you. How do you know the President's doctor? This too I will tell you when we meet. Within half an hour he arrived with the doctor. The doctor examined me and wrote out a prescription. I was getting more and more curious. I asked the doctor, how do you know Mr. Chandraswami? He answered, he is my guru. Chandraswami was grinning from ear to ear. He was in his sadhu garments. After a few minutes of doctor left, Chandraswami was in his element. I am flying tomorrow to Belgrade to meet the president of Yugoslavia. He is sending his private plane to pick me up. This I thought was going over the top. Any more fairy tales? I asked. Just then the telephone rang. My personal secretary said, Sir, our ambassador in Belgrade is on the line. I was dumbfounded. The ambassador informed me that Mr. Chandraswami would be arriving in Belgrade tomorrow in the president's personal plane. Should I receive him at the airport? The Swamiji was grinning. I gave the ambassador a masterly diplomatic answer. Use your judgment. Wonderful Chandraswami. Chapter 43. A medium called Albert Best. Albert Best was a most remarkable Irishman who during his life brought to thousands of grieving pupils. Himself from the working class, he influenced people of all kinds, cutting across religion, class, creed, and even reaching out to non-believers. He was a bridge between this life and the world of spirits. Albert Best was born in Belfast on 2 December 1917. He was perhaps among the greatest mediums of his generation. During World War II, he served as a soldier in North Africa. He was severely wounded and left for burial with 8 other corpses. A voice told him to get up, which he did, and walked away. He was again wounded, captured and tortured in a German camp. He was invalidated and sent back to England in a ship. On arrival, he was told that his wife and 3 children had been killed in a bombing raid in Belfast. Albert wondered why he had not received any letters from his wife. He was told the mails were not getting through. In 1944, he began attending the Kilmarnock Spiritualist Church. It soon became evident that Albert's extrasensory perceptions enabled him to communicate with spirits in the other world. Like the Hindus, he believed that the body perishes, but the soul is immortal. My wife met Albert in early 1970 in England through another medium. She believes that a highly evolved medium like Albert can help us establish contact with people who have passed on. Time and time again, through Albert, she has been able to communicate with her father, who died in 1974, and many others. Later, with our daughter, who left us in 2002. This was through a young medium friend of Albert's, whom he had introduced to Haminder. What is the definition of a medium? A medium is the instrument who has the ability to connect a person from this world with someone from the other world. As the years passed, Albert's name and fame spread. He became known beyond the British Isles. He was invited to the US, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. In each country, he provided living proof that mediums possessed something that most people did not. Albert Best came to India 4 times in the 1980s and 90s as our guest. By word of mouth, the news of his being in Delhi spread. With each visit, the number of seekers multiplied. They were in need of consolation and solace. They came from all walks of life. No one left disappointed. Besides being a medium, he was also an accomplished healer. The reader might rightly ask, this is too vague and amorphous. Can you be more precise? I shall give only 2 concrete examples while explaining the methodology first. His practice was to make a person sit on a chair opposite him, and then sometimes he would go into a trance. The sitting had begun. He would say to him or her, your ex, whom you have lost, is here, and ask you to look for the watch you are missing in the 3rd drawer of your study table under some papers. It was indeed found there. The point was to prove that there indeed was communication with loved ones. Aslam and Firoza Khan are good friends of ours. Aslam is well known in the sports world. He was, for a short while, a minister in Uttar Pradesh. Firoza is a fine painter. Their son Afzal was my son Jagat's, Firoza's friend at Doon College School. During holidays, he often stayed with us in our home, 9 Safdarjung Road. He was a born charmer, handsome, loving, ebullient, and amusing. He became a part of the family. The 1989 UP elections had been called. Afzal left Delhi for Dehradun to be with his parents. His father was a candidate. He decided to follow the jeep carrying some of the sealed ballot boxes so that these would not be tampered with. His vehicle was stopped by armed thugs. Afzal protested. He was shot and died on the spot. He was only 20 years old. His parents were saddened. We were devastated. Some months later, Aslam and Firoza had a sitting with Albert at our home. His dad had completely destroyed the symmetry of their lives. Their sorrow was deep and all-pervasive. On their way from Dehradun to our place, they were delayed by traffic. My wife observed that Albert was restless. He kept saying Afzal is already here and he is keen to talk to his parents. The parents met Afzal, who told them what had happened on the day of his death. He did not see the weapon with which he was shot, as it was hidden under the shirt of the assailant. This sitting lasted several sessions. With every session, the sorrow of the parents receded and serenity took over. Albert Best went into coma on 2 April 1996. On 11 April 1996, he came out of his coma, looked at the foot of his hospital bed, and said to his 3 friends who were present, don't hold me back. My family has come to take me. On 12 April, he drifted out of the harbour on a silent tide. P.S. Readers might be interested to learn that R.K. Narayan, the author of Margaret novels, remained in almost daily contact with his wife, who died aged 30 in 1940. R.K. lived to be 96. His novel, The English Teacher, is largely about his dimension of his life. Curious Life. Chapter 44. An encounter with Al-Qubaisi. Quebassy. Chi Pai Singh will rank among the top 20 artists of all time. His paintings, not one in oil, sold for 1505 crores in 2010 rupees. I am probably the only Indian who met the distinguished and venerable Quebassy, Peking not yet Beijing, in the mid-1950s. Had three towering figures from the refined world of painting, dance and literature. The dance master was Mei Renfang, a friend and contemporary of Uday Shankar. They had first met in New York in 1931. Mei Renfang was the greatest Peking opera dancer of all time. Even in his late 50s, he continued to play female roles. On several occasions, he gave me tickets to watch him perform. During the Japanese occupation, he grew a mustache and successfully evaded the invaders. Rao C was the literary giant. B. He had lived many years in the United States. In 1949, P.M. Chow and Rai invited him to come home, which Rao C did. His novel Rickshaw Boy was a world's best-seller. I met him 2 or 3 times, once in the company of Hans Wayne, the author of A Many Splendored Thing. Rao C committed suicide during the Cultural Revolution. I had seen a brush painting of Chi Pai Singh in many offices and museums. He mostly painted birds, shrimps, crickets, chickens. He patiently studied their activities before painting them. During the war 1941-45, Chi became popular with American soldiers. They were no connoisseurs of art, but were attracted by the celebrity status of Chi. He would sell a painting of a chicken for $10. The Yankee would haul Master Chi 2 chickens for $10. Please draw one more. This Chi did. He did not begin life as a painter. 4 years, he was a carpenter, similar to M.F. Husain, who at one time made wooden toys. His date of birth is somewhat flexible. It is generally agreed that Chi was born in 1863 in Hunan province. Getting to see him was an occasion in itself. The Chinese Vice Minister of Culture, Chen Chen-to, was good enough to help arrange the pilgrimage. I had got to know the minister in 1954 when he led a culture delegation to India. Chen was a scholar of repute and an expert on Rabindranath Tagore. He died in an air crash a few years later. For several years after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the government paid no attention to Chi. Then a dramatic event occurred. Prime Minister Zhou Enlai called on him on his 90th birthday in January 1952. Life changed overnight. Master artist Chi was allotted a house, provided with a servant. Occasionally he was exhibited to foreign dignitaries. He became a national icon. His paintings were suddenly in demand. I arrived at his house on 17 December 1956 at 11 a.m. It was bitterly cold. I was greeted by a smartly dressed in blue Mao outfit young man. I walked across a modest courtyard to reach his sanctum study. For a brief moment I did not notice him. His tiny frame was crumpled on a comfortable chair. He was wearing a black cap and was dressed in the pre-1949 long cotton overcoat, no buttons, which was wrapped around him. The sun shone through the window above his head. I was hell-bent on getting as much out of the visit as possible. At first he did not register my presence. I asked a question or two. His son, the young man who had received me, shouted in his father's ear. For a second or two the eyes lost their opacity. The mind connected but the body did not cooperate, and he sank back into the chair. Then suddenly he came to and offered me piping hot green tea. I inquired who his favorite Chinese painter was. Chen Painting. The name meant nothing to me. I was expecting him to name Shu Pei-hoon, famous for his painting of horses. Next question. Have you seen any Indian paintings? Yes, I have seen Indonesian paintings, came the reply. At 93, India and Indonesia were one and the same. Then I asked, what do you think of the Peace Prize you received? I don't know if my paintings have any peaceful content. He had never been out of China. He told me he no longer painted. He used to paint directly with a brush on Chinese paper, no pencil drawing. I learned he was also an expert in seal engravings on ivory. In his youth, he wrote poetry. I bought 2 of his paintings. The son was a bit of a wheeler dealer and sold fake pearls. Mine were not. I paid the equivalent of ₹600 for them, one with 4 chickens and an exquisite one of a black eagle, 24 feet long. When I left, Chief Pasi got up to shake hands and walked to the doors to see me off. This is how I remember him, waving like a little angel. Thank you very much for listening. Remembering by heart, Chief Pasi. Chapter 45. The Dalai Lama arrives in India. The day His Holiness the Dalai Lama crossed the Tibet-India border. In the closing hours of March 1959, I was in Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's office in South Block with the IFS professionals of the 1958 batch. After 1957, the PM did not meet new entrants to the IFS individually, but received the entire was taking down notes. The PM asked me, "Kya likh rahe ho? What are you writing?" Before I could answer, Foreign Secretary as Dutt walked in and whispered in the PM's right ear. Almost immediately, the PM got up, saying that he had to be in Parliament as something of great significance had cropped up. Later, we learned that the Dalai Lama had sought asylum in India. Nehru immediately responded positively. This was in keeping with our age-old tradition of offering hospitality. The reaction in China was ferociously vituperative. The reactionaries in India have always harbored expansionist ambitions toward Tibet and have carried out various forms of sabotage activities. Dalai Lama was dubbed as a rebel. The People's Daily of Peking wrote, "We give a solemn warning to imperialists and Indian expansionists. You must stop at once, otherwise you will be crushed to pieces under iron fist of 650 million Chinese people." Hardly the language of a friendly country committed to the principles of the Panchashir Treaty signed between India and China in 1954. Although the government had firmly told His Holiness to refrain from making controversial pronouncements, he did make statements which could have been avoided. His taking the Tibet question to the UN in September 1959 was ill-advised. He did so contrary to the advice of the Indian government. His Holiness has now been in India for 53 years. Some time back, he announced his decision to give up his secular duties and concentrate on his spiritual activities. The announcement caused consternation among his devotees and followers. China reacted in a childish and peevish manner. I have been following events in China for more than 5 decades. To me, it is incomprehensible how a great country, which was Buddhist till 1949, can be so afraid of and obsessed with a man who is respected, revered, and venerated by millions of people all over the globe. He preaches compassion, forgiveness, goodness, magnanimity, and life-changing precepts of Buddhists. His personality is so engaging that he casts a spell on anyone who meets him. Inner light radiates from him. On arrival in India, the Dalai Lama spent a few days in Tezu, then proceeded to Mussoorie, where Nehru and prolonged talks with him. He came down to Delhi in September and was put up at Hyderabad House. I was attached as temporary liaison officer to His Holiness. He met very many pupils, including the upcoming poet Dom Morarji. The Dalai Lama was in playful mood. Dom referred to nature, helping him during his escape from Lhasa, blinding storms, thunder, lightning, etc. His Holiness replied that nothing unusual happened. Such weather was usual in Tibet during that time of the year. This somewhat deflated Dom. Dalai Lama called on several cabinet ministers, all treated him with respect in spite of his age, 24 only. His meeting with Home Minister Govind Ballabh, I remember vividly. We were ushered into a small room which, if I remember, was used as a reception room for receiving the distinguished and the eminent. The Dalai Lama sat opposite Pandit Pant, his interpreter next to him. Raja Pant, Govind Pant's son, was also present. I occupied a chair behind His Holiness. Top secret matters were being discussed with complete candour. Halfway through the meeting, Pantji looked at me and asked, "Who are you?" I was taken aback. Relief came when the Home Minister next pointed to a man sitting behind me, who nervously said he was from the Press Trust of India. Dalai Lama was startled. After all, he and the Home Minister were dealing with diplomatic dynamite. I had no doubt in my mind that Pantji would ask the more than errant PTI eavesdropper to leave the room. This he did not. Instead, he requested the Dalai Lama to continue. I thought the minister's decision strange. After the close of the meeting, Pantji asked the man to stay behind. He then proceeded to read out the Riot Act to him. If a single word of what was done, the consequences for him would be most unpleasant. Nothing was ever published. What mystified me at first was Pantji letting the man stay. I later understood. Had the PTI man been sent out, he would have reached for the nearest phone and filed a story that would have caused serious complications. To this day, I have not forgotten Pantji's serenity, sagacity, and masterly handling of a tricky situation. He was among the greatest of our Home Ministers. Chapter 46. A brief rendezvous with Don Bradman. My three non-Indian 20th century heroes are Don Bradman, General Bo Nguyen Giap, and Nelson Mandela. I have met General Giap and Mr. Mandela several times. Sir Donald Bradman only once. In October 1989, I carried letters from Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi to Prime Minister David Range of New Zealand and Prime Minister Bob Hawke of Australia. David Range was the wittiest man I have ever met. The meeting with him was cordial and relaxed. The one with Bob Hawke did not go so well. His accent was haughty Australian. Hawke backed a predecessor of his, Malcolm Fraser, for the post of Secretary General of the Commonwealth. We did not, Hawke, if memory served me right, took it for granted that Fraser would make it. Rajiv Gandhi and Bob got on well. Both were severely critical of Margaret Thatcher's policy on South Africa. Indira Gandhi thought poorly of Bob Hawke at the 1983 Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting held in Delhi in November. This was Hawke's first summit. He was not familiar with the subtle nuances of international diplomacy. The Indian PM practiced benign neglect of the not-so-charming Australian. Margaret Thatcher was a bully and generally got her way, not with Indira Gandhi. Now back to Prime Minister Bob Hawke, I gave him Rajiv Gandhi's letter, which he kept on a table by his side without reading. Fair enough. Then he came to Malcolm Fraser's candidature. He said Commonwealth countries were showing intellectual lethargy and delaying their decision on Secretary General's election. And more of the same. Ministers of state are at a disadvantage when parleying with prime ministers. At the same time, it was impossible to let a high-handed PM get away without being challenged. I said that India was not intellectually lethargic. The fact was Malcolm Fraser did not have enough support. India supported Sony Rampal, who was doing a splendid job. Hawker calmed down and the meeting did not end on a discordant note. Soon after I learned that later in the evening Hawke was flying to Sydney for dinner with Don Bradman. I sent Joint Secretary A.K. Buddhiraj, who was accompanying me, to find out if I could possibly take a lift to Sydney. The previous day I had driven from Canberra to Sydney, for the Australian Airlines were on strike. Had my meeting with the PM ended on a discordant note, I would not have asked this favor. On the flight, Hawke was both charming and friendly. He was in a dinner jacket and a black tie and reading from a photo. It was his speech for the Bradman dinner. Swallowing my pride, I was about to ask if I could meet Bradman, but before I could do so, Hawke came up with a burble gem. Minister, would you like to join the Bradman dinner? All my life, I had dreamed of meeting the great Don. As a schoolboy, I had even written him a fan letter. I kept a scrapbook full of his picture. I thanked Hawke, saying that I was not properly dressed, but I would very much like to meet Sir Don Bradman, who was one of my heroes. Of course, Minister, it would be foolish of me to say that I was not excited. I was. We arrived at the hotel. We were taken to the Prime Ministerial room. Sir Donald and Lady Bradman were already there. So was Sir Colin Cowdery. My eyes were glued to my hero, all of 5 foot 7-inch dinner jacket, balding, 81 years of age. Don, this is Minister Singh from India, said Bob Hawke. My pulse quickened. This did not happen to me even when I had met Fidel Castro. I put my hand out and so did Sir Don. Silence. Then the great man spoke. Not too long ago, I met your railway minister. I forget his name, nice chap. He was referring to Mother Ross India. Sir Donald, I have been hero worshipping you since my school days. I am deeply honored and moved to meet you. I said, how many times must have Bradman heard such inane remarks? A photographer appeared. After some hesitation, I asked Sir Don if I could have a photograph with him. Why not, said Hawke. The photo was taken. The PM, the Bradman, Sir Colin and myself. Next day the photo was published in the newspaper. I had been cut out. Mesmerizing day. Thank you very much. Chapter 47. Nehru and Gordimer. Among the whites who opposed apartheid, 2 names stand out. Alan Paton, the author of Cry the Beloved Country, and Nadine Gordimer, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1991. I first heard of Gordimer, born 1923, when I was High Commissioner to Zambia in the late 1970s. Both he and Patton were relentlessly condemned and harassed by the racists. Neither bent nor bowed. In early 1991, I, as Vice Chairman of the Indira Gandhi Memorial Trust, was asked by Sonia Gandhi to invite Nadine Gordimer to the 4th Indira Gandhi International Conference to be held in New Delhi in November. She accepted. On 13 October, she was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. I sent her my congratulations. She thanked me and also expressed her inability to come to India in November, as she would now have to change her schedule for the next few months. She was distressed at having let you down. I hope you will forgive me for this dereliction and that I may be able to visit India under your auspices at some later date. 2 years later, the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Fund invited her to deliver the 1995 Nehru Memorial Lecture on 13 November, a day before Nehru's birthday. The subject of her lecture was our century. She touched our hearts and stirred our mind. It was literature on a grand scale. He commanded our attention as no other Nehru Memorial lecturer had in recent years. She was candid. Her mind was witty in thought. She was provocative, speaking up for socialism with a human face. On Nehru, Gandhi and Mandela, she was superb. She spoke the breaking color and preached the balance. While concluding, she quoted Nehru, who in prison had written about the problems of individuals and social life, of harmonious living, of a proper balancing of an individual's inner and outer life, of an adjustment of the relations between individuals and groups, of a continuous becoming something better and higher, of social development, of the ceaseless adventure of man. During her 4 days in New Delhi, I was lucky to have several informal, spontaneous conversations with the diminutive and still beautiful Nobel laureate. These were not interviews. At a dinner at my home, she was at ease, relaxed, and disarmingly reflective. Sonia Gandhi was also present. Natwar Singh asked, "Were you surprised to receive the Nobel?" She said, "Yes, I was. Mind you, I had been shortlisted, but had never really thought I would get it." Natwar Singh, "How did you hear the news?" "I was in New York, got a telephone call from a friend in London." "Has it changed your life?" "No. At the same time, the demands on my time have increased. Vast correspondence, invitations. I have learned to say no. The other side is that you can give a push here and there for a cause or something. Attention is great. The prestige of a prize helps." We talked of Attenborough's film Gandhi, also fosters a passage to Gandhi. Not surprisingly, the conversation drifted to David Ian's film adaptation of the book. I said I had strong views about Ian's production. It was an outrage. In his lifetime, Foster had turned down all suggestions of his novels being filmed. Once writer Santha Rama Rao suggested to him to allow her and me to write a film script for A Passage to India. Foster replied no. He told me I would not be able to control the production. Nadine Gordimer wondered why Satyajit Ray did not do so. Another day we debated the merits of Nelson Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. She said the first half was written by Nelson Mandela in Robben Island and smuggled out. It is so good. The second half is done by Richard Stengel, so the book suffers. At one stage, Anthony Sampson was to collaborate with Mandela, but somehow it did not unfortunately work out. At that time, my enthusiasm for Long Walk to Freedom precluded even the mildest criticism. My hero worship of Mandela was undiluted. When I reread the book a decade later, I came to the same conclusion as Nadine Gordimer. Natwar Singh asked, "What are your impressions of Ajanta and Ellora? You have just been there." He said, "The history of art and architecture is so Eurocentric." I asked, "The Sistine Chapel appears small compared to the great art I saw at Ajanta Ellora, and so much older." Natwar Singh, "How did you get interested in India?" He replied, "When I was a young girl, I came across Stella Cramsby's school book on Indian art, was fascinated by it, and had wished to see Ajanta and Ellora ever since. The settings of the caves is wonderful. It was a rare opportunity to hear her overview of the current situation in her country. I asked how the land problem was being tackled. 80% of the land was owned by whites. Natwar Singh, would they part with it without a fight? She said, "Yes, this is a serious problem, but the government is working out on an acceptable formula. In many cases, the government would buy the land and give it to the blacks." I asked the post-Mandela scenario, "How do you see that?" She replied, He is, of course, the greatest man in the world. There are excellent people with him. They will take over. The bureaucracy is a problem. I asked what about Chief Buthelezi? She replied, he is a negative element, always walking out of cabinet meetings. I asked the Indian community its future. She replied, they were a part of a struggle against apatheists and suffered much. The speaker is now an Indian, Ahmad Kathrada, who was with Mandela and Robben Island, is in charge of the president's office. The Indian community should have no fears. On the day she was leaving, I took advantage of her kindness and pestered her with a couple of more questions. I asked, when did you first hear of Gandhi? She replied, he said, I came across his book Satyagraha in South Africa when I was 17 or 18 and I was deeply affected. I asked, and Foster? She said I must have been 10 or 11 when I read A Passage to India and thought it a wonderful book. Still do. I am indebted to her in more ways than one and treasure the inscribed copy of her book, Writing and Being. She wrote, it was a pleasure to meet a like minds. Thank you very much for listening and hats off to such a genius lady. Chapter 48, Husain the Genius. In early 1957, Maqbool Fida Husain held an exhibition of his paintings at the All India Fine Arts and Crafts Society Gallery, New Delhi. Dr. Zakir Hussain, the Vice Chancellor of the Aligarh Muslim University, arrived unannounced. Walking up to Hussain, he said, Khaksar ko bhi Hussain kehte hain. This humble man is also known by the name of Hussain. What a marvelous episode. I first met M.F. Hussain in the summer of 1958 at the Belsiray Vault, now Zakir Hussain Marg, flat of Narayan Menon, Deputy Director General, All India Radio. I asked Han Swain, the author of A Many Splendid Thing, to come along. There he was, the future genius, tall, thin, black-bearded, vaguely resembling an Old Testament prophet. He had not yet arrived, but was well on the way to becoming the most talented, most sought-after Indian painter of world renown. We soon became friends. He was great fun to be with. Among his enduring quirks was to be chronically unpunctual. He was a genius to whom mundane standards could not apply, and never did. He set the pack of his life, not the clock. In early 1961, I bought a Fiat car for ₹11,000. I was then living in a Delhi Gymkhana club. Hussain dropped in to ask if he could borrow my car for a couple of hours. Yes, but drive carefully. It's brand new. Barkodar fikr mat karo. Do not worry. And off he went. He turned up 2 days later. For 48 hours, I was on tenterhooks. I was livid. More worried about my car than Hussain. I knew he had no driving license. I asked, where the hell have you been? Can't say, was the brief reply. It sounds funny today, but I was not amused then. To make up for it, he painted an enchanting portrait of my companion, a very beautiful young lady. That painting is 50 years old, while I was living in New York between 1961 and 66. Hussain stayed with me twice. My apartment became a studio of sorts. He painted portraits of R.K. Narayan, Ved Mehta, Pearl Buck, and 2 of mine. You can see these portraits images in the same book. At the last, one morning he announced, I am leaving this evening. I asked where he was leaving for. The answer, I will decide when I get to the airport. Years went by. I returned to India in early 1966. I was selected to serve in Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's secretariat. Hussain and I met often. He took me to a kebab shop in Old Delhi many times. He lived in a room in Jangpura. He had no telephone. I used my PM secretariat badge to get him one. From time to time, he expressed a wish to do a portrait of Indira Gandhi. I spoke to the PM. No formal sitting, Natwar, she said. I conveyed this to Husain. A Saturday in early January 1970 was fixed. To my great relief and surprise, he arrived 5 minutes before time. With a chuckle, he said, "Jara ghari dekho." Just look at your watch. I asked him into the PM's room in her South Block office. After depositing him in a chair opposite the PM, I made a move to him. Never sit down, otherwise I will become self-conscious. I obeyed, as was her habit. He kept looking at the files on her desk. Husain got down to work without any ceremony. In a few minutes he was done. He gave the sketch to the PM. He looked at it for half a minute. "You have made the lower half of my face resemble my father's." Husain took the sketch back and started all over again. The second effort was approved. While coming out of the PM's room, I said to him, "Let me tell you that to fit you in, appointments of several visiting ministers had to be rescheduled." He was not impressed. "अच्छा किया, खुराफात पकते." Good. They would have spoken rubbish. When he stayed with us in London in 1974 or so, he had achieved iconic status. His fortunes had changed, not his character. He remained austere, non-pompous, lived on air, walked barefoot, had a long brush, travelled without baggage, with only a thaler. His paintings were selling. Our children adored him. He was great fun but never flippant. Husain was a great, very great artist. He was also a great human being. He was born with not even a copper spoon in his mouth. He never went to any university. He was endowed with a self-awareness no university could give. Life and love, art and friends, passion and pains were his priorities. He knew his work and was grateful for it. He distrusted the establishment and never got onto any bandwagon. Sarda Prasad and I persuaded him to accept a nomination to Rajya Sabha in 1986. He did so with grace. His Sansad Nama is an extraordinary work. I still remember his absent-mindedly walking into the Lok Sabha, a staggering parliamentary folly. But he got away with it. Artistic license. Yes, that's the phrase. He lived a long life, a good life. He was a very wealthy man towards the later part of his life. He once told me, "I know the importance of money, but I have no love for it." Husain was not just a great artist, he was a phenomenon. He had a presence. I last met him in 2005. I got news of him from mutual friends when he shifted to Dubai and Qatar. Freshness and buoyancy never deserted him. The bounds bygones inflicted on him affected him deeply. He wanted to return to his homeland to die. That was not to be. This star of high voltage leaves behind an army of friends, admirers, devotees and cheerers who will always miss him. We also miss Husain Sahib. Next chapter, All is Well, that ends well. One of the most joyful experiences of my life was my friendship with two wonderful and gifted human beings. In every way, both were exceptional. Sunil and Nargis Dutt opened many doors and enriched my life. Sunil Bhai was for 30 years one of my closest friends. He was a first-rate film actor. More importantly, he was a great human being, hearted, compassionate, public-spirited, and sensitive. His wife was not only the most beautiful woman of her generation, she was also the queen of post-1947 cinema, Mrs. Nargis Dutt. In the most bizarre circumstances in the summer of 1976 in London, I was at the time Deputy High Commissioner there. Between May and September, a large number of Indians arrived in the British capital. Many of them came to shop. Among their most frequented destination was Marks and Spencer in Oxford Street. Nargis was no exception. One sultry July afternoon, I was in my office in India House, Air India. He gave me the starting news that the film star Nargis was with him. She was suffering an acute anxiety. The police had picked her up as she walked out of Marks and Spencer and charged her for shoplifting. She was discharged after confessing and told to appear in court the next morning. She now wanted to come to India House to seek help. I entrusted the manager to send her to my office. I also asked my wife to join me. Nargis thus arrived, drained, disabled, and in tears. We told her to calm down and tell us her tale of woe. This is what she said. She had bought some forgery items and paid for them. She then remembered finally forgot to pay and walked out. She was immediately caught by the police and taken to the police station. She pleaded innocence. She was not believed. Confused and shocked, she confessed. Having heard her, I said, "Since you have already confessed, the matter ends there. Why did you do so if you were innocent?" Her answer was, "I was so frightened of going to jail. So in panic I confessed. I had an appointment at the Foreign Office, which could not be postponed. I asked her, my wife, to keep Mrs. Dutt company. On the way to the Foreign Office, I asked myself why should Nargis conflict? She was famous, wealthy. She was a charismatic and iconic individual. I made no sense. My instinct told me she was innocent. In any case, it was my Indians whenever the necessity arose. I decided I would stand by her. After my official office business was over, I asked Mr. P if I could bring up a delicate and pressing matter with him. "Go ahead," he said. I related the melancholy tale. The Indian counterpart of Elizabeth Taylor was in my office, frightened and sobbing. If the newspaper got hold of the story, it would become another irritant in Indo-British relations, as it is the emergency had showed them. Besides, no one in India would believe to pity Lasensi. He heard me out. His response was, "Since he has confessed, what can we do?" "Help," I said. "It is no secret that the British establishment is good at benign news management. Could he," I implored, "be so good as to ensure that the incident was not unduly played up by the media?" I realized I had no authority to ask for such a favor. I took the risk because I was convinced that Nargis was not a kleptoman. He left me and returned after a few minutes. He asked me what is her name on the passport. I had no idea. Using his telephone, I called Nargis. She enlightened me. The name on the passport was Fatima. He noted it. He frankly said he could give no assurance, but would see if we can do something informally. The good man suggested that it would be wise for Nargis to go to court the next day in plain clothes and wear dark glasses. I thanked him and returned to India House. Sitting in my private secretary's office was the London correspondent of the Indian Express. He gave me a copy of the story he intended to find. His story did not appear. Next morning, plain Miss Fatima went to the court, paid the fine and was let. The British press ignored the incident. This would never have happened without the back channel assistance of P. On her return to India, she wrote me a letter on 10 July 1976. "I don't find words to thank you for all that you did for me. If not for your effort, I would have been crucified by my own pupil. Instead of facing humiliation, I would have killed myself. I owe my life and prestige to you. I am indebted to you for life. I will go and see Mrs. Gandhi and try to explain to her exactly as things happened." 5 years later, she lost her life to cancer. She was only 52. She lived a short life with glory. We are missing you, the great lady. Now, Chapter 50. Remembering Dev Anand. I do not claim intimacy, but I knew the late Dev Anand since our first meeting at the UN in New York in 1962. It was summer. Somehow he traced me out. He needed no introduction, I did. He had learned that I knew the novelist R.K. Narayanan well. Could I give him a letter of introduction? I said I would be glad to do so. But could he tell me why he wished me to do so? He said he wanted Narayan's permission to make a film of his novel, The Guide. I obliged. A few days later, Narayan wrote back, "It was awfully good of you to give my address to Dev Anand, who wrote to me and then met me, and we have arrived at a very satisfactory arrangement for the production of The Guide, both in Hindi and English." Years rolled by. In October 1969, Dev Anand came to Delhi and sought me out. I was then working at Indira Gandhi's office. Dev Anand said he was keen that Prime Minister watch his latest film Prem Pujari. Could I arrange for him to meet her and invite her? I spoke to the PM. She agreed. Word got around that the PM would be receiving Dev Anand at her South Block office. Work almost the corridors stopped in the Ministry of External Affairs. The corridors were soon teeming with the hierarchy waiting to see Dev Anand. From lower division assistants to IFS officers, all crowded the corridors. I took Dev in. He requested the PM to see his film. She said she would like to do so but was very preoccupied. However, she would try to adjust her situation. At the end of meeting, she walked down the corridor with Dev Anand and myself. By now, the bureaucracy was out in every nook and corner to see the rare sight of Indira Gandhi and the matinee idols walking together. Before getting into her car, she asked me to see the film and let her know what I thought of it. Dev took me to the cinema hall of the Air Force establishment on South Jung Road. I liked the film and reported the PM. Alas, he could not find time to watch it. I fondly recall the intensity of his personality and his infectious vivaciousness that was life affirming. He has now joined the immortals of the film world. I prefer remembering tomorrow. His memory will be cherished by millions. Thank you very much for listening. Now we have many pictures and letters in this book. So the recording of the book is over. Thank you very much